Welcome to this NIAS Talk at Spui 25 on the 15th of October 2020. Tonight we're going to talk about whose climate crisis we're in, actually. We have a wonderful program with three excellent speakers. This NIAS Talk, I will introduce them in a minute. Uh, I will first tell you a little bit more about what NIAS is. NIAS is the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Fenneke Wekker. I'm head of academic affairs at the NIAS. And this is an international institute and where an interdisciplinary group of scholars, artists, journalists, and writers can work on their own book projects or on their own research projects. And at the same time, they collaborate, they work together to, in a way, move their comfort zone, to move beyond the boundaries of their own disciplines and to really study more innovative methods and gain more insight in their field of study. Um, Tonight, I will talk with Jaap Tielbeke, who was our journalist in residence last year at NIAS. He's a journalist at the Groene Amsterdammer, and he has just published his book called in Dutch Een beter milieu begint niet bij jezelf. A better environment does not start with yourself, with you, in very badly translated English. Jaap can tell you more about it. And first, I will have a short interview with Jaap about his book and about the main takeaways of the book, which is kind of thought-provoking. And then I will introduce Jaap Handmaker and Daphina Misiedjan, who are two fellows who will start at NIAS in February. And they are part of a larger NIAS theme group. And the theme group that they're working on is called Legal Mobilizations. And analyzing law-based advocacy. And Jaap Handmaker teaches human rights and legal sociology at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and his focus lies on human rights and legal sociology. And he conducts research on legal mobilization. Daphina Misiedjan also works at the International Institute of Social Studies, and thereby she's a board member of the Dutch section of the International Commission of Jurists. And her work focuses on issues concerning human rights, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights, and the environment. So this promises to be a very interesting night. Thank you all for being here. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A. You can find the button, the button on top, on the bottom of your screen. And I already see that there is a question from James Kahan, whether the book is also in English. We will discuss this with Jaap in a minute. I will try to answer your questions after each small part of this program. Okay, and you can also raise your questions in Dutch. I will try to translate them as best as possible. Okay, then I would like to welcome Jaap Tielbeke. Jaap, you can start your video and unmute yourself. Welcome.
You see me all right? Yeah.
Yes, perfectly well.
Okay.
How are you doing?
Good, Fenneke. How are you? Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Yes, so Jaap, you were a NIAS fellow last year, and we were very happy to have you at the Institute. And so it's a year ago that you were still deeply involved in the writing process of the book that you are now presenting. And can you tell us a little bit about what the project was that you were working on and why you thought that this was so important?
Yeah, sure. So I've already been working as a journalist, thinking and writing about the climate crisis for the Groene Amsterdammer. That's a Dutch weekly for those of you who don't know it. And one of the things I quickly realized was that this is not a story about, climate science per se. It's not about physics. This is a topic that touches upon almost anything. It's about economics, it's about psychology, it's about politics, very much so. And so I've written, over a dozen articles over the past 5 years. And slowly I started realizing, I started seeing this overarching theme and this overarching message. And I decided that I had some insights I wanted to share with, a larger audience, insights that I couldn't really fit into a separate article. Also, one of the big questions was the question we are discussing tonight: whose climate crisis is it? And so I was very fortunate that I was able to write the book at the NIAS, because it's really like the perfect environment for a journalist working on a topic that is so interdisciplinary, and that was very, very helpful to gather all these insights from scientists all across the world working on very different topics that could discuss your ideas, give feedback, learn about their research also. So that was really, even though I was already in a writing process, it was really useful to, it was pre-corona times, fortunately, so we could discuss during lunch or during the Thursday afternoon sessions, and that was really helpful. So yes, the book, it's not available in English yet. We have to
Will
figure
it
out
be in the
if,
future?
I have no idea, but if there will be a translation, we have to figure out a better title, because the Dutch title is specifically, a negation of this slogan that was launched by the Dutch government, which really addressed the climate crisis as something that individual consumers could solve by turning off the lights when they would leave home, or recycling, or eating less meat, stuff like that. So it's really in the framework of, this is something that individual consumers can and should address. And I oppose that view. I argue that it's actually been harmful and counterproductive.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this? I believe this is the overarching message that you wanted to convey in your book. Why is climate change, so we moved from the idea of a climate change, I believe 10 years ago we talked about climate change, and now we moved into this idea of a climate crisis.
Yeah.
Why is it not possible for me to start living a better life and more conscious of the environment and change it?
Of course, it's possible. And like, to be clear, I don't want to discourage anyone to do that. But I think we shouldn't think that this is the strategy by which we can solve this climate crisis. You're absolutely right. Like, when I grew up, like in the early 90s, this was the popular slogan. This was the message. And as a kid, I really believed that, and I encouraged everybody in my surroundings to follow that advice and to live in a more sustainable way. But actually, we're 30 years later, and this climate change issue has evolved into this big ecological crisis. Climate crisis, even too narrow of a term almost. And one of the things why I think this dominant frame has been harmful, is because it answers the question, whose climate crisis is it, or rather, who is responsible for this crisis, as it's all of us. When we talk about the climate crisis, it's often said that we're all in this together. Like, humankind has caused this mess. We have cut down the rainforest and polluted the oceans and pumped the atmosphere full of greenhouse gases. And this obscures the fact that we're not all equally responsible. Recently there was this Oxfam report that illustrates it very clearly. Over the last 30 years, the richest 1% is responsible for almost 2 times as much greenhouse gases additions to the atmosphere than the poorest half of the world population. So this narrative really obscures the power dimension that is at stake. And it's no coincidence that this frame has been this message has been pushed quite deliberately by fossil fuel companies, fossil industries, and basically they're for example BP around 2005 they started to popularize this idea of the ecological footprint. And the CEO of Shell is still his main message is still, as long as the consumer asks, we provide. So we pump up the oil as much as we can because society is demanding this from us. And this is really misleading because the idea is, well, okay, as long as you don't change your own lifestyle, we don't have a responsibility to change the course of our business. Whereas the CEO of Shell or CEO of BP is in a completely different position and has a completely different responsibility than, for example, the individual automobile driver. People in politics or in at large businesses, but especially in politics, they have the power and the responsibility to make structural changes, to make systemic changes, and that's exactly what we need. And if we remain stuck in this view of this is a consumer issue and we can solve it as consumers, then we won't get any further, I'm afraid. This climate crisis will continue to grow.
I cannot help but think of the current corona crisis and how politicians try to solve this, also by emphasizing the importance of behavior, of behavioral change of each individual. That if, as long as everybody behaves better, the crisis will be solved. Is that similar? Is that a similar message that politicians and companies have tried to convey, that as long as we all take our individual responsibility, it will not turn into a crisis?
Well, I think the remarkable thing we've seen during the corona crisis is that when the government actually perceives something to be an immediate and grave threat, that they are able and willing to pose very drastic measures. And that's what we saw during the first lockdown. That's what we're seeing now again. So the government, they really made harsh decisions. And you could argue that we need the same strategies to curb this climate crisis. But the problem is we don't seem to have the same sense of urgency, and politicians don't have the same, they're not taking these same drastic measures that we need. But you're right. Recently we're seeing the policies of the government have been criticized for being not stringent enough, and then the government is saying, yeah, okay, but this is behavior. It's the fault of the individual citizens that are not following the rules. And with the climate crisis, I think you have something similar in the sense that it was also a tactic by governments, by people who are actually responsible, saying, well, it's not up to regulate big businesses. If you want big businesses to change, then you should send a signal as a consumer. So vote with your shopping cart. That was the dominant idea. And we have to conclude that this is not the way to go. This is not working.
So in your book, which is really a great read, so I can indeed, I would sell this to anyone, even if you don't read Dutch, just try. So I believe that your main claim is that the climate crisis, although politicians and companies, the fossil industry tries to make it an individual responsibility, is mainly a political crisis in a way, or the politicians do not take their responsibility. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how a climate crisis can be political if it is about the climate?
Well, if it is about the climate, the tendency is also to think about this as an issue of simply removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or preventing from entering the atmosphere in the first place. So a lot of the times we talk about the climate crisis, whether it's only about this energy transition. But really, if you comprehend and if you take into account the full scope of the ecological crisis, this is about our modern way of living. This is about the way we have designed our economy. And if you take the climate crisis, the ecological crisis seriously, it's hard to escape the conclusion that that has to change drastically, systemically. And then you enter on questions that are unavoidably political. If this is about the way, the change in the way we live, we travel, we eat, then these are political decisions. What kind of society do we want? What kind of economy do we want? The issue of climate policy is unavoidably tied up with questions of justice and questions of redistribution. Who is going to pay the bill? Who is going to carry the load of these of this transition? So this is the discussion we ought to have. This is the discussion we ought to have, not only, in the political realm, but also in the society at large as a public debate. But too often, and those are the frames that I discuss in my book, the misleading myths, I call them,
Yeah.
they ignore this. What they have in common is they ignore this underlying systemic questions that we really have to ask, and we have to ask ourselves, who is responsible, who is truly to blame for this climate crisis that we ended up at this point, and how can we change this? And in that sense, it's when I say politics, I mean it in a broader sense than just parliamentary politics. I mean it in a fundamental political question, like what kind of society do we want if we accept that a lot has to change.
And indeed, if you talk about politics, I also hear that you emphasize the power structures at play in this in how to deal with the climate crisis or this ecological crisis. And indeed, what you said, that there are different types of responsibilities. It's not so much that this sole car driver does not have any responsibility at all, but there are different extents to which people are responsible, to which people can contribute to the solution, if I understand you right.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's clear, and it's becoming increasingly clear, also because of the many lawsuits that are being, being held right now, that the fossil fuel industry for over decades, even though they knew their business model was harmful to the planet, they had the science in house. But what they decided to do is trying to block drastic climate action by casting doubt on the climate science. And there's a good book written about that, Merchants of Doubt, which compares it to the strategies that the tobacco industry used. And actually, they're really the same people that followed this strategy. So, when we talk about who can we consider a constructive partner, we have to take these kind of power dynamics into account. There are powerful players that are bound to lose their position when we take seriously what needs to be done. And so, maybe just one thing to be clear, because when I say this is a political issue, I don't mean that we as individuals can just, sit back and relax and let the politics or the CEOs handle it. My argument is that because, this question of how can I contribute and what can I do is completely legitimate. It's completely understandable to want to, when you face with this enormous challenge, you want to get involved. But I think what we need to do is get involved not so much or not only as consumers, but more as citizens, by applying. And this is something I'm sure we can talk, we can dig a little deeper into when it comes to the court cases. But there's various ways to assert political pressure as citizens. So that's also my argument in the book, that we have to change the way we think about how can we contribute.
Yeah. So this is very clear, but and let's now turn to to the legal mobilization. So if you say it's in essence a political question or a political crisis, what does this have to do with law? Because in a democratic society, people would say we should keep law and politics separated. So how can we? What's the role of legal mobilization in this?
Hmm. Well, the interesting thing about the legal mobilization when it comes to climate change and the court cases I mentioned in the book is that they are not afraid to pose the very relevant question: who is to blame? Whose climate crisis is it? Who is responsible? In the Netherlands, we obviously had this very high-profile Urgenda court case. The first court case was won 5 years ago in 2015, and the argument was the government is not nearly doing enough. This is also a human rights issue, and the government is not taking its responsibility. So that is these very relevant question of whose responsibility is it, by bringing them into the court, which is a place where you can objectively decide on these issues, and both camps have to provide evidence of their claim. These are very relevant questions, not only in the courts, but also in society at large. And I think it's very important to understand, even though law and politics are separate, they're also intertwined. And I think, but maybe he can correct me if I'm wrong, this is actually something I talked about with Jaap Handmaker when I spoke to him almost 5 years ago, also discussing the impact of the Urgenda case. And one of the things he explained very well, and others have explained to me as well, that these court cases are not, they're not in a vacuum. They have an interaction with the debates in society. So even when some of these cases, they might not win, or they might not have the desired outcome from the point of view of the climate crisis, they can have a tremendous impact on politics. There is, besides court cases against governments, we see an increasing number of court cases of fossil fuel companies being sued. Also asking the question, okay, we're now confronted with the costs of rising temperatures, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, what have you. But whose bill is this? Who should pay for this? And maybe we can go into a specific case at a later point, which really illustrates this in a very remarkable way. But I would just argue that these they do address these structural questions that are so relevant, and they inspire each other, each court case after another. So law can be a way of shifting the debate, shifting the way we think and talk about climate change, and especially the responsibility of this climate crisis.
Great, thank you. Before we go to the next part with Jeff and Daphina, are there any questions from the audience? Anything you would like to ask Jaap at this point? If so, you can post it in the Q&A, and then I will try to address it later. There's not yet any questions. Okay, Jeff. Oh, wait, it is tricky to find help for sustainable transitions. Okay, this is a remark. Can you respond to that, Jaap? That it's tricky to find help for sustainable transitions.
And there's
Currently
some elaboration.
involved. Yeah. So Mosman is saying
organic.
Yeah. So he says, or she, I'm not sure, it is tricky to find help for sustainable transitions currently involved in organic agriculture. I'm not sure if this is clear to you.
Well, I don't know if this answers the question, but the agricultural question is, of course, very high on top of the political list in the Netherlands, and it's very that was also very telling for me because, for example, when we talk about our dietary habits, we encourage each other to eat less meat because we know from a sustainability point of view, this is the right thing to do, or this could be helpful. Eating meat is harmful for the environment, and you see that the norm is shifting. I don't know what it's like at NIAS now, but I think there was, it's mostly vegetarian, right? Or you
Yeah,
always have a vegetarian option. Um,
we're fully vegetarian now. Yeah,
Right. So that is telling of a certain shift that's going on. But when you look at the numbers of meat consumption in the Netherlands, it's hardly any lower than it was 15 years ago. So to make this transition in agriculture, and this is coming back to the question, hopefully, we need to change the way we or the politics um, um, distributes subsidies. What kind of agricultural system do we want? And of course, this is very much also on an EU level, where you had, on the one hand, this plans of making a more sustainable agricultural system, but at the same time promoting European pork meat to export it. So, if you talk about we need help, we need to find help for sustainable transitions. Where do you look for help? This is the crucial issue, and I think as long as we don't have, we're not aware of these, for example, the subsidies and the way that they stimulate certain forms of agriculture, we won't be able to make this transition.
exactly. Thank you. Okay, let's move to, I see there's some more questions, but I will have to wait or you will have to wait for a few minutes because we will now first turn to Jaap Handmaker. Jaap, can you, we see your screen already. Can you also put on your video so we can see your face with it?
Yes, hello, good evening.
Hi, yes, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's nice to join this discussion and really a pleasure to come after Jaap, who indeed I had a discussion with 5 years ago about all of this. And it's in a way sort of continuing the discussion and reflecting on that. The first thing to say really is that law absolutely is politics. They're more than intertwined. Law is embedded in politics. And I say this as a social scientist, although if you say this in a law faculty, it's pretty controversial even today. So then this project on legal mobilization actually makes this assumption, and I'm not alone here. I'll briefly introduce some of my colleagues in this project. But when we analyze law-based advocacy, we regard legal mobilization as more than just going to court. There are many ways in which the law can be used, and I think that we're already discussing that with Jaap. So, as Yap's book suggests, studying legal mobilization requires a long-term perspective. It also requires making a clear distinction between different uses of law. So while legal mobilization is the legitimate use of law to reinforce social justice claims, lawfare can be regarded as the illegitimate use of law to suppress others. And I can maybe build upon this a bit later on in the discussion. But in this regard, you can look back in history, for example, the role of law during apartheid, where I worked as a young human rights lawyer, or gaze at disputes and governance challenges which are manifested in the present day. For example, the role of law during the Trump presidency, Black Lives Matter protests, or the global climate crisis, indeed. So why is it important to study? Well, law on its own accomplishes nothing. Something must happen. So how the law came to be and how it is used, either through legal mobilization or indeed through lawfare, are profoundly political questions. Accordingly, legal mobilization is embedded within particular positions of power, as is lawfare, reflecting both general interests, so the interests and indeed the values of society, as well as specific interests and values of elites, but also disadvantaged individuals and groups. So what does all this mean in practice? Because it's both conceptualizing what legal mobilization is, but also what it means in practice. Well, law reinforces inequalities. For example, it protects property rights over people's rights to land from where they were, for example, historically dispossessed. But law can also be leveraged to promote equality, for example, through a land restitution tribunal, which one has been seeing in South Africa. So legal mobilization recognizes the potential use of law to amplify people's general and individual interests where they are unjustly disadvantaged, also against the elite use of lawfare. So to kind of close this sort of brief introduction about the project, actually, two of our colleagues are following this Zoom as well, I saw. So Jackie Dugard is working on the role of legal mobilization to challenge water apartheid. She's making a comparison between Soweto in South Africa and the water impoverished and polluted communities in the United States of America, particularly in Michigan. Frederic de Vlaming is researching how breaches of international humanitarian law can be redressed through legal mobilization to facilitate the truth and rehabilitation of victims. Margareta Vivarinka Singh is analyzing human rights litigation for climate justice, of course, very relevant to our discussion here. And in the process, also looking at the intersection of different legal regimes, which is really important, the legal pluralism involved here. Daphina Misiedjan, who's going to elaborate in a moment, hear more about her project, is going to talk about how she's looking at the rights of nature. And as for me, well, I'm interested in the strategic potential and limits of legal mobilization against the many different social justice struggles, also in different parts of the world and including climate justice. So in 5 minutes, Fanika, this is what we're hoping to do.
This is incredible, Jeff, and such a rich project. And I'm so proud to have you at NIAS working on this project from February on. Thank you so much. This is only the start. We will now see or listen to Daphina's short introduction. Thank you, Jeff. You can turn off your video and mute yourself. And Daphina, you can start your video. Thank you. You can introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Fanika. And good evening, everyone. I'm very happy that I could join this discussion to discuss whose climate crisis it is. And when I look at it from the perspective, I look at it from a perspective of environmental justice. So to really answer the question about who is responsible, just like Jaap mentioned, who is actually benefiting from certain development, for instance, and how can we make sure that we find a solution that is actually also in favor of social justice? Because we have to remember that someone is always paying the price. So a lot of the development that we've seen so far, which has mostly been taken place in the global north, has been responsible for a lot of degradation in the global south. But not only actually the global south, we can also see that the climate crisis is not only about global south, global north, but also about the dimensions within the global north. We can see that especially marginalized and marginalized communities within the global north are also at the forefront of this climate crisis. So in that sense, we have to really open up the discussion to see who is benefiting, but also who is getting the short end of the stick, and how are we going to solve that? So in that sense, law to me is indeed central because it is, of course, political, but it also talks about values. It talks about how different values are embedded in the life that we have. And it supports certain issues such as indeed ownership, but also how do we divide, redistribute, etc. How do we allocate different resources? And therefore law is really a central part of that. So in addition to this, I also look into my research around rights to nature. So that is the movement that gives actually entitlements and rights to natural entities. And this sounds very kind of big or a bit weird, but basically the idea behind it is that we're going to move away, or trying to move away, from the idea that man is dominant over nature and can use and exploit resources just willingly without thinking about also responsibilities. So rights to nature really take into consideration that humans have responsibilities also towards nature, and that nature should be respected in a certain kind of way. And that is also embedded in law. So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but this is my short introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daphina. Such rich perspectives on this climate crisis. Jeff and Jaap, can I ask you to show yourselves so we can move into the panel discussion? I see that there are some more questions. Let me first try to... There is a question from Koen Leurs. He asks, what do you make of the varieties of governmental responses or non-response? Does transformation require governments to move beyond neoliberal worldviews? Is it possible to stick with growth focus? Who would like to respond to that? Perhaps you, Jaap?
Well, those are big questions. Can I first just say that I had my camera turned off, but I was nodding in agreement the whole time Jeff and Daphina was talking. And I really wish I could be at NIAS for another year, because I'd love to, pick their brains and hear more about their research. But to come back to this question, the short answer, this term neoliberalism, of course, it's discussed a lot of the times. It's being used as it's used very often as this umbrella term of everything we don't like. But if you define it in a very strict way, in the sense that the main thing for the government to do is ensure that free markets are working on all different terrains, then surely this is not the way to address the climate crisis, because that's what we have been trying for the past 30 years. That was the dominant message also from governments around the world. They don't want to step in and act as a policeman. They want to let the market take care of it. And in order to do that, we need to be responsible consumers. And as long as we have the right intentions, the market will solve this climate crisis. We've seen it with creating new markets to price CO2 emissions. And all of these examples, they have not had the desired results, to say the least. So for sure, the neoliberal mindset, so to speak, is not getting us closer to where we need to be in terms of growth. I think so. Like, I've become more and more convinced of this, that the obsession with GDP growth and economic growth has become very harmful. I've been diving into a bit more of the degrowth research. I'm not quite sure where I sit on this whole discussion, but I think one of the remarkable things is when you talk to economists, almost all of them will say, yeah, of course, we know that the focus, we know that GDP is an imperfect standard, and we know that only focusing on GDP growth can be harmful for the planet and the environment. We know all this from the economic disciplines, but yet when in the political domain, in the political discussions, it's really curious to see how dominant this still is. When we talk about the coronavirus recession, when we talk about, Prinsjesdag here in the Netherlands, where the national government presents its budget plans, it's all about GDP growth still. So that is a very strange discrepancy to me.
Thank you,
I think it's actually very consistent. I mean, just to maybe say something briefly there too, is that it's very consistent with political liberalism, which is all about insisting that the individuals resolve their disputes with other individuals, be they companies or other private individuals, and that the government retreats. And that's just a classic position that governments around the world have adopted. So whether you call it neoliberalism or just pure liberalism, or economic liberalism, it's all really part of the same kind of ideology.
I think that, Jaap, you just mentioned we need a different mindset, and that is already what emerges from the first presentations that that the three of you gave. That I believe that you are already very advanced in creating or having this new mindset, in the sense that law or jurisdiction should be perceived as political, as deeply political, and thus should play a role in this. But also, Daphina, to give nature rights. I believe that is a shift in the public mindset, to think of nature or of natural entities as entities with rights, because in a democracy, we would say, with rights also comes duties. Can we also say that nature has duties then?
Yes, that is often indeed the question. What is then the other side, or what is nature expected to do? But indeed, we have to frame it in such a way that we create rights or grant rights to nature and natural entities, but those are considered to be typical rights that would suit them. So a right such as for a river, the quality of the water needs to be of a certain type of quality. We can talk about the river actually not being circumvented, for instance. So then if you start looking at the obligations that stem from them, it's more about, as a community, still being able to use the river in a certain way, alongside these type of ecological boundaries that we're setting.
Exactly. Jeff, perhaps I can ask you, can you give, are there any examples yet of court cases that have tried to create or shape these systemic changes and have succeeded to do so, in your eyes?
Well, I mean, their agenda case is the case that's on many people's lips, as a successful example of legal mobilization. In this case, the more classical example going through the courts. Of course, this involved a great deal of time and money, resources. So it was liberal elites that brought this particular case, a consortium. And of course, there's a lot to sort of say about that particular case. But it really was quite profound how the judges themselves realized its implications, not just for the Netherlands, but internationally. I mean, it was translated into English. The judge himself, the chair of the court, made very clear that this is also directed to judges in other countries. So that's really significant. But beyond the court cases, I think it's important to recognize that legal mobilization is much more than that. So the protesters against the Dakota pipeline, who are protecting Native American land, are very much conscious of the human rights involved. They're very much conscious of the constitutional rights involved, the right, including, very importantly, the right to protest, and various agreements that were made between the United States government and the Native American communities. So, but it's taking the form of public protest. It's not going to court, but that's still very much legal mobilization. When people boycott products of a company because of their actions in this country or in countries abroad, that also has a very profound legal flavor, because it's involving human rights violations, it's involving maybe sanctions violations, such as during apartheid South Africa, or in Iraq, or in other countries which have been subject to sanctions. And the most, I think, maybe colorful example is when a company here in the Netherlands, say, wants to tender for a public service, like public transport or rubbish disposal, rubbish collection and disposal, like the Veolia Corporation, which was subject to challenges by organizations that said that no, Veolia Corporation should not be allowed to tender for public services here because they are complicit in human rights violations, in this case, in the occupied Palestinian territory. So it's a really interesting how diverse law is taking different forms of public protests and responses, and how really, if you talk about whose crisis is anyway, well, this is, of course, the community standing up and claiming the responsibility of governments and corporations.
Yeah, so this is also a very important part in your book, Jaap, that you describe how intertwined human rights and nature rights in a way are. When you talk about, let me pronounce the word, ecocide, is that how I should pronounce it?
Yes, I think so.
Perhaps you can explain what you mean with this term and how human rights are intertwined with
so
it.
this is not a term I came up with.
Okay.
There is this, pretty, famous campaign of a lawyer a while back, the Scottish lawyer Polly Higgins, and she really promoted this idea of ecocide, that this is one of the missing crimes against peace, and we should, incorporate it in the international criminal court, so we can actually hold CEOs or people personally responsible for crimes against the planet, basically, for crimes against the environment. And it's good to mention that a lot of people, when she held that story, people thought that this is an outlandish, wild, radical idea. But she always mentioned that apparently when you go back and you look at history, it's not so wild, because it was actually for a long time, it almost made it to the statutes, the Rome statutes of the International Criminal Court. It was blocked by a couple of countries, including the UK and the Netherlands. And so she, launched this campaign to get it on the political agenda again. And unfortunately, she passed away last year, I think, or the year before that. But this campaign still continues. It's something that, for example, the Pope has already, expressed his support. And I think what is interesting, and I'm also curious to hear Daphina's thoughts on this, is that I always wonder, to what extent is this a concept that will actually help us win concrete court cases, and to what extent is it more a way of, like you said, changing the way we think? Because when you talk about giving rights to nature, or even giving rights to future generations, I also spoke to lawyers or legal scholars who said, really, it might be interesting, but we don't need it in a strict sense to win these court cases. For example, the Urgenda court case, it was not about future generations. It was just about existing laws. So, maybe this is a question Daphina can ask. To what extent is it more about a changing mindset? And to what extent, I'm sure they're intertwined in a way. But yeah, I'm curious to
Daphina,
hear your thoughts.
can you give it a try?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that when we start looking at law, there are, of course, different ways in which law can be instrumental, or what type of effect law can have. So I think including a term such as ecocide, I think because you already put it on the agenda, because you have more people discussing it, because you also have more states stepping up. For instance, Belgium and France have now also said that they want to support putting ecocide within the Rome Statute. So that already kind of gets this rumbling going on within society, that society starts to think about this, but also that companies might start thinking about the future and thinking, okay, well, if this becomes really an issue, then I have to also look at the future and how I'm going to respond in the future to this type of thing. You are correct in the sense that indeed in previous cases, we've seen that laws that already exist can also be used effectively. But what is interesting is that it's often pushing of the boundaries of law. So within the Urgenda case, for instance, it's also one of the times that they started to use human rights to actually support environmental rights. So in that sense, it's still, there's nothing new that was added, but it is kind of looking at what is the possibility. And you can do that with judges and courts that actually want to venture into that type of argumentation. So there's also a very central role that the courts play into seeing whether or not they are experimental or want to actually address and research these type of topics and how that can be covered within the law. Because also in other countries, like the rights of nature, for instance, in Colombia, has also been a court case that actually put that forward or actually made that happen in connection to rights of future generations. So I think we're all just looking to see how we can use the law more effectively. Sometimes cases are successful, sometimes they are not. But even the cases that are not successful can actually bring about a certain change within society and also within the legal realm, because we as lawyers start talking to one another and start to think, okay, this didn't work, but maybe something else will work if we argue it in such a manner, for instance.
There is a comment or a question in the Q&A from Ryan Yessuren, and he rightly touches upon the point of time. Isn't time our greatest enemy here, and how to deal with future generations if we don't have enough time now to pursue all these court cases and to make this mind shift? Jeff, can you respond to this?
Sure. Well, I mean, Jaap's book amongst is but the latest to stress the urgency of this task. You know, I mean, we can and should do indeed our best to be good citizens, to put solar panels on top of our roof and be vegetarians and so forth. This is very important, and he very much acknowledges how that's important, but is clearly not enough. And the clock is ticking, and we need to do more to actually reverse it, not even just stop climate change, because that we might even be potentially too late for that, but to reverse it is just going to require really quite profound structural changes. And this does indeed demand the changing of economic systems. The fact that we are now in a corona crisis, I think, reveals something very interesting possibilities also for what can be accomplished overnight, which climate activists have been trying to accomplish for many, many years. That is to completely shut down international travel, and certainly to reduce it drastically. And of course, we are still seeing greatly reduced international travel. But why I think it's so important in terms of looking at legal mobilization to emphasize that it's not just through the courts, it's not just through formal trias politica kind of systems that we must work. Is that people can claim the law themselves, and they are claiming the law themselves in many different creative ways, because they recognize, people recognize that we do not have the time. So we cannot simply wait for the courts and the politicians, although that's important. So I think it's really important what Ryan raises here.
Yeah. There's another question from James Kahan, who talks about the internal contradiction of the term free market. If you talk about more regulations or the measures that governments can take, should governments regulate markets much more? What is the role of politics and the free market in this? Who would like to respond?
Yap, how about you?
Yeah, I saw you starting.
No, you're absolutely right to make the air quotes with free market. That's why I did it previously as well, and I think that's what the question refers to, because actually, free markets require already a lot of regulation. So this whole idea, even that we live in a market economy where markets are the dominant organizational form, is quite misleading. So there's always political decisions behind the way we've designed our economic systems. And most clearly to me was I realized that when I dove into this idea of carbon markets in the European Union, we have this emission trading scheme, and the idea was we want to reduce greenhouse gases, CO2 particularly. So what can we do? We will have a system where we give out rights to companies and we reduce these rights gradually. And because these rights, they can be traded amongst companies, and because emitting CO2 will cost money, this will enhance sustainable innovation. But what you saw happening is that actually we lost a lot of valuable time because we had this market system in place, and governments or politicians were saying, no, let the market handle it, and any other kind of more direct form of regulation was seen as this interference with the market systems that were already there. And in fact, because the big polluters had such a strong lobbying power, they managed to obtain a lot of free emissions rights. So the price of the emissions was extremely low. We handed out too much emission rights. And because of that, in fact, the big polluters made money instead of paying for their pollutions. And what is so frustrating about it is that this market system, it basically obscures the political choices that are behind the construction of this market. How we make this market, how high we set the ceiling, how many free rights, emission rights we grant to companies. So in effect, that decides the price of the emission trading scheme. I know it's a bit of a complex story, and that's another part of the problem, because we've created this complex system, which makes it hard even to debate, and which makes it hard to protest. But it really tells you that actually markets are always a political construct.
There are coming more and more questions in the Q&A, which is really great, being really inspired by them. So I will pose two more questions, and then I have another question for you, because the time we're only having 15 minutes left. So indeed, this was also a question I got when I read your book, Jaap, that and this is also a question for you, Daphina and Jeff. In court, is it possible to have jurisdiction over companies or states, as Frederike asks? Is it not only possible to make an individual responsible for something he or she has done and to solve the problem? How can you make a state or a lot responsible and pay for it? Is that legally possible?
Yeah, I think I'm going to start off, and then Jeff can add, because indeed within law there are different avenues that you can take to keep, for instance, to get companies accountable. So you can think of, for instance, tort. So when you have certain damages, you can hold different companies accountable. But what you see, of course, is that it often comes down to who has the most money to hold long, tiring cases, who has the most money to pay for lawyers to really argue themselves out of certain situations. So you can see that we've had a couple of authoritative decisions when it comes to certain companies. For instance, Shell is having a few cases concerning pollution, but also concerning different, almost violent acts, I would say. So there are examples of companies that have been held liable. When it comes to states, one of the challenges that we are having is looking at extraterritorial responsibilities. So indeed, to look outside of the state itself, what type of responsibilities do we have there? Because in connection to what Jaap was saying about the free market, a lot of the damage that is being done is being externalized. So we're taking the benefits of, for instance, producing or exploiting natural resources abroad, but in the West, we're not necessarily paying for that. And what you're now seeing is that we're also trying to have cases where extraterritorial responsibility of states is becoming an issue. And I think Urgenda is actually one of the cases that might actually put a little bit of fire in that direction, because it directly recognizes the responsibilities of the state. so far for its own citizens and those within its own territory, but it is connected to climate change. So you can imagine that maybe the next step would be the responsibility of states and companies abroad.
Thank you. Jeff, you want to add something?
Well, there's not too much more to add. I mean, I think that that's a really comprehensive picture of where we stand. I mean, Frederike de Vlaming, another one of our colleagues in this legal mobilization project, she and her colleagues have been, for many years, looking at various ways in which states can be held accountable and companies can be held accountable, also for their actions abroad, here in courts in the Netherlands. So that's something, of course, she's going to be studying further in the context of this project. But it's quite a recent phenomenon that formal legal mobilization, I should say, going to court to hold companies and indeed states accountable has been taken. It's really very, very recent. And that's, of course, because of the liberal construction of the legal system, which is, as I said, I think I mentioned earlier, all about insisting that individuals resolve their disputes with other individuals while the state retreats. So that I think one of the questions here was, Lex Lohman has raised a question from Milio Federaci that well, when the judge is unjustified or said unjustifiably to take over the position of a democratically legitimated institution, such as governments and parliaments, well, if the state is acting in an illegitimate way, you know, what is the community to do? It also has the right to address the state's own accountability. And in that sense, judges are recognizing that their role is not simply to defer to the executive, but actually also to hold governments accountable. There's in the case that Daphina outlined, but in many other cases as well. And the Rawageda, for example, which dates back, of course, to the Netherlands, so the colonial heritage, that also very much was a groundbreaking case in insisting that the Netherlands also has responsibilities also for what happened in the distant past. So that's quite important and very significant, but a recent development, challenging this liberal ideal that individuals resolve disputes amongst each other.
Well, sorry,
Just briefly, because I just read the question of Federica, and she's specifically referring to the International Criminal Court that can only hold individuals accountable, which is right. I'm not sure how I stand on this idea of Ecocide, but that would mean that the CEO of Shell or individual politicians, they actually had a mock court case against the Dutch Minister of the Environment. That was, they investigated whether they could hold him personally accountable. And she asked, like, doesn't it take us back to the focus on individual responsibilities? This is indeed one of the things I doubt about this strategy, but the argument is also that it would have a chilling effect, or how do you call it? That people in positions of power, because they are aware of the possibility that they might be held accountable, for crimes against the environment, crimes against the earth, they would take this into consideration in conducting their business or making political decisions. So the argument is not, let's put a couple of people in jail and then we've solved this problem. The argument, again, is taking it back on changing the way we think about taking responsible decisions. So in that sense, it could contribute to this mindset shift we've discussed.
Yeah. And if I could add shortly to that, I think one of the aspects in that is indeed the power aspect. And if you put individuals, or if you make individuals responsible for their actions, then that should relate to the amount of power that they have. So when you're talking about the individuals and their whether or not they are eating vegan, et cetera, then you're looking at the small circle of influence or the small responsibilities that they have. But when you look at such individuals that are responsible for whole economies or whole companies, then you can relate that to the amount of power that they have and the responsibility that they can take in that respect.
Certainly.
That's a great addition. I think we've lost Fenneke, no?
Yeah, I was also trying to talk through it. Yes.
Free for all.
Yeah.
Here I am again.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
there she is.
I just finished my thought, so right on time.
My internet just crashed. Oh, that was panic. Okay, here I am again. So I bet you've discussed it all. You solved it all while I was away.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. So I'm sorry, I missed your last sentences.
Maybe just to jump in there, this question directed to Daphina from Fatima Kamal, I think it's also from YouTube. It's asking, does the conclusion of concepts like ecocide and more than human entities allow for a whole different kind of balancing in jurisprudence? Where the right to water, for example, human communities are now balanced with the economic necessities and property of businesses. World courts enacted balance inherent right to existence and non-interference of these geographic locations with that of business. Would that not be an improvement, Daphina, to the current balancing of human rights versus economic property and public good interest?
Yeah, exactly. So the rights of nature movement really takes into account the intrinsic value also of certain natural entities. So not only to look at them as being useful to humans, but also to have an intrinsic value, just like, for instance, human rights look at the intrinsic value of humans and what type of rights come along with that. So indeed, it then puts them in a place of having a voice and having to be balanced against these other interests that are out there. So hopefully that makes it a more balanced decision. I mean, giving rights to things that are inanimate, we already know that from, for instance, companies. A lot of companies have, for instance, also legal personhood or certain rights. But now we're also trying to indeed include nature or non-human entities in order to have a balancing act. And of course, this really comes from the worldviews of indigenous peoples. So originally it really sprung from Ecuador, Colombia, and New Zealand. So that should also not be forgotten, that often this rights of nature movement also comes along with environmental justice for groups who have previously been marginalized.
Thank you, Daphina. I see that there is another question. I suggest this is the final question of the audience before I pose my final question to all the speakers. This is a question from Mariette. She asks, when we talk about future generations, how about starting school with lessons in connecting with nature to stimulate the transformation of the mindset we've been talking about? Jaap, can you say something about education and changing of the mindset and systemic change?
Yeah, I think that can be, of course, hugely important. It might be a safe answer, but what is interesting is that one of the cases I described in my book, and I'm sure Jeff and Daphina know this case very well, is the case of Antonio Oposa, which is a Filipino lawyer, environmental lawyer, who won a court case in the 90s against deforestation. And his argument was also that this would harm the rights of future generations. And what was remarkable about the court sentencing, there was basically said, even though it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, this is so obvious that we have a right to future generations that it's obvious that this is also a legal principle. So I think, like Daphina said, in a lot of cultures, and especially in indigenous cultures, this is something that is so embedded in that culture, and it might not be in our culture today. And in that sense, education could play an important role. I don't know how Jeff and Daphina, as educators, feel about this.
Yes, Jeff, can you respond to this?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, education is absolutely crucial, and the role of children, school children, in all of this. I mean, in history, whether it's during apartheid South Africa, where children literally led the anti-apartheid movement in 1976, through to the present day, where Greta Thunberg has, triggered a really powerful global movement of kids. There's another case, which a colleague of ours who specializes in child rights, Karen Arts, has been looking at, of school kids who brought a case in the United States. It's been stymied at every turn. Of course, if you talk about power, it's really powerful corporations that these school kids are going after. But yet they managed to really make a lot of noise and build public awareness about climate change through their efforts, which is already a massive success. Even if they didn't win in the courts, they still accomplished a huge amount. So I think that's really significant.
So education, yeah.
I'm sorry.
So sorry,
Daphina.
Daphina.
I indeed think that actually education for young people would be nice, but at the same time, I think they are already very much educated, and knowing that this is also an issue of their generation. They are the ones that are left with the broken pieces, basically. And also because we're going to have to make this change in the upcoming 10 years. So we need to be able to reach 2030 at a stage that is actually sustainable. And I think that, yeah, that it's indeed not necessarily the kids that need to be educated, but it's definitely more of the politicians and people actually hold power, because I think children are doing as much as they can with the measures that they have available right now.
I mean, education is also not just taking place in the classroom. I mean, it's taking place at many different levels. So these cases are also enormously important for education, indeed, of the kids themselves, as well as everyone around them. So.
In that sense, we could see education as a form of legal mobilization, wouldn't you think so? I'm not sure. Because you really make use of the power as a pupil or a student, or yeah. So my final question, and then we have to round up this discussion, is what really strikes me, and I cannot help but making the comparison to how we deal with the corona crisis at this moment, because it is now obvious for anyone that it's not only a health crisis, the corona crisis, but that it's also a social crisis, an economic crisis. It's multi-layered. And what I hear you saying is that we need to make this mind shift towards perceiving the climate crisis not only as a natural or an ecological crisis, but much broader, as a social crisis, as a political crisis. To come back to from this perspective, to come back to the first question, the frame of this discussion, from your perspectives and this multi-layered approach, whose climate crisis is this, and who should we make responsible, and what would be our individual responsibility to make this happen? Daphina, will you start trying to answer this tiny question?
A multi-layered question. So indeed, for me, whose crisis is it? It is, well, the global north is responsible for this crisis, I would say. I think it is indeed multi-layered in the sense that many different actors need to start working together, but also need to recognize their responsibilities in solidarity. And I think in that sense is also very much connected to this COVID-19 situation, because it really reminds us that my actions directly affect other people. And that in solidarity, I need to start also looking at the privileges that I have and try to limit those. And I know that that sounds very scary to a lot of people, but at the same time, yeah, you should try to also be looking at how you can support others in their rights while recognizing your own obligations and responsibilities. So in that sense, I do think that we all need to take our own individual responsibility in that sense to see what we can do and what our direct circle of influence is, and hopefully be okay with taking up that responsibility and putting down certain hedonistic behaviors. That sounded very preachy.
Thank you. Very concise. Jeff.
Yeah, I'm reminded by Runa Chandrasekhar, who mentioned recently in an article in the UK Guardian that we all need to be aware of the lenses that, quote, filter people into little boxes of faceless climate victims and the rest of us. Because I'm really picking up what Daphina was saying here, is that poor people, both in the global south and the global north, are much more vulnerable than elites. They feel, and it goes the same with the corona crisis, they feel the impact of global crises, economic, environmental, and indeed the current pandemic far more profoundly and with much more devastating consequences than those of us who are wealthy. So you've got to really see the intersection between all of these different problems. And here, I think we also need to be cautious about using the word crisis as well, because it's not as if this is something that happened recently. It has a very, very long durée. And by characterizing it as a crisis also tends to sort of miss what's underpinning that. So we have another colleague, Kareem Kneal at ISS, is looking at the pedagogy of crisis and how we have to learn from how it is that law has been, for example, applied to deal with crises, and to challenge the illegitimate use of law, such as lawfare, which is profoundly destructive to public participation. It smothers any criticism from organizations like Greenpeace, and it's very, very anti-democratic. So yeah, we do need to see these intersections, and it's all of our responsibility for sure, but primarily the role of big corporations and the states, which regulate to their benefit. The state is regulating, it's just not regulating to hold them accountable, it's regulating to facilitate so-called free trade.
Thank you, Jeff. Jaap, you have the final words.
Okay. Well, I think Jeff and Daphina are absolutely right to point out that we are actually not all in this together, that we have not, this is not a crisis or climate disruption that was caused by humankind as this abstract entity. This was caused by particular actors, mostly in the global north, by wealthy countries, people who profited from this, and there are other peoples who are now paying the price. And like you both mentioned, the tragedy is that most vulnerable people are actually being hit the hardest and the soonest. So this is something that is absolutely crucial to always keep in mind when we talk about this. And I want to come back to the idea of the young people being actually the educators. And this youth climate movement is something that really makes me hopeful, especially when I compare it to my own youth and the messaging back then. As I mentioned, I was really impressed by this slogan and these commercials that told me you can help the environment by reducing your own carbon footprint, basically by changing your behavior and your lifestyle. And that's what I did, And now we're seeing these kids, they're not internalizing the guilt. I mean, sure, most of them are also living consciously and sustainably, but they're taking to the streets and they're actually saying, as Greta Thunberg said, how dare you? So they're holding the people responsible who are actually responsible. So I think that is a great lesson that we can learn from them and that we should take in a similar way, individual action as citizens.
Thank you so much, Jaap Tielbeke, Jeff Handmaker, and Daphina Misiedjan for a wonderful discussion, very thought-provoking. Thank you all at home for engaging in the discussion and for following us. If you are interested in our other NIAS talks at Spy 25, please subscribe at our newsletter at the website nias.knw.nl. And on the 26th of November, we will have our next NIAS talk at Spy 25 with Iris van Rooij. Thank you all so much. We'll see each other hopefully soon, and sleep well. And don't worry too much. I believe, I hope.